Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for wherever you are in the world. My name is Isaac Painter, and I'm a security business operations lead at Adobe. And I'll be speaking with you today about creating a security policy framework that works. So first, some legal stuff just to get out of the way is that the language quoted in this presentation is provided for instructive purposes only and does not reflect policy language used by Adobe. Additionally, this language should not be copied verbatim by anyone in the audience, as each company must tailor their policies to their own circumstances, and opinions expressed are my own. So imagine that you're in this scenario where you receive an email from somebody and they say, hey, do you know if we have a policy on this? And you don't know. So you loop someone else into the thread and you say, hey, do we have a policy on this? And they say, well, I heard of one, but let's go ask so-and-so. And before you know it, you've got 16 to 17 people, excuse me, added to a thread, and one of two scenarios ends up happening. One, you identify that there is no document that is in existence, and you need it right away because the auditors are asking if you have a policy on this, and you got to have one, otherwise they're going to identify a gap. And so you go ahead and create one. You create one, and then it's not thrown into some sort of repository. It's forgotten about, and that's a typical scenario. The other scenario is you end up finding that you do actually have one, but it's been 2 years or 3 years or 10 years since it was last reviewed. And the person who wrote it no longer works for the company, and it has a ton of out-of-date information in it. And so these are common scenarios that we'll see across the board. And this is not unique just to security policy. This is policy in general, is that we'll see a lot of these different scenarios where reviews aren't happening. There's not awareness of the documents. We have old documents that haven't been reviewed forever. There's no author or ownership. They're hard to find. And then there's multiple sources for all these different documents that we need from a governance perspective. And so if we want to create a policy structure, we need to define what it is that needs to look like. And so first off, we need to define what our governing documents are. So we're going to really emphasize what a governing document is and what a non-governing document is. So governing documents are things like policies, standards, and procedures. So your policy is where you want to start. What is your strategy? What is your commitment to some sort of security subject? So or it could be logical access, or it could be your operations, or it could be just your overall arching information security policy. Regardless of what it is, you want to be able to define what your strategy and commitment is and scale it across the company. You don't want to have factions of policies all over. And then your standards, you also want to scale across the business, but those are going to get into the very specific requirements of how you're enforcing your policies. Or sorry, not how, but what it is you're doing to do the policy. Then the procedure is the how, the detailed instructions, and those are typically at the business process level. They're not always scaled across the business. The entire business might consume them, or maybe certain teams and services, but those are different teams and services that are actually writing them because they own the process or the procedure or the diagram or the run book that details that. Those are the instructions on how you're able to implement the requirements of the what, and then your why. Your why is really in your policy. So your governing documents are really your must-haves. And then your non-governing documents are your nice-to-haves or your should-haves. Those are your guidelines, your best practices, or your recommendations. And so best practices sometimes can be converted into your must-haves, but they're also sometimes your should-haves or your nice-to-haves. So here's an example of what a governance structure might look like. So you might have a policy called the logical access policy. And then under that, you've broken it out into multiple different standards on what it is you're doing to meet that commitment that you've written in your policy. And then these are all the standards that in the very specific requirements on the bare minimum requirements for these different subject areas. So some might say, well, why didn't you just have one logical access policy that has all these different subjects for account lifecycle authentication, remote access, secrets management, and customer authentication? But why don't you just have them all in one policy? Well, then you're going to get like a 30-page policy. It's not going to be consumable. It's going to be way too intimidating for people to read, and it's going to be hard to update. It's just going to be unwieldy all around for those managing the policies and also those reading the policies. And so just to be able to break it out into more subject areas is helpful. So here's an example of some policy language. So your company is committed to protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data with which it is entrusted. Your company strives to protect its ongoing operations from known and unknown threats. So that's your commitment. That's your strategy of what you're going to do. That's your why. And a logical access policy might say something like, logical access mechanisms shall be automated and enforced on your company information systems in a manner aligned with the risk and criticality of the system and the sensitivity of data it handles. So again, very high level. Your policies don't change a whole lot from year to year. And then your standard language is going to get into those very specific requirements. They're going to be a bit longer. They're going to have a lot more content in them. They're going to change from time to time more often than your policy might. Yeah, for example, you might have an authentication standard that says passwords must expire and be changed every blank number of days or sooner. Or you have a vendor security standard that says a contractual agreement must be entered into and retained with the vendor who processes or stores your company confidential data. So as we read through those examples, here's a few highlights to point out. You want to avoid words, absolutes, like all and any. The reason for that is from a legal perspective, when you use those words, you're saying perfection. You're saying 100%. So you can strive for that. And if you remove the words all and any, in fact, it doesn't really drive home the point anymore. And in fact, it could even get you in trouble. And so you're saying you're going to do access reviews on a quarterly basis. Well, if you say where all accounts must be reviewed on a quarterly basis for access privileges, your intention is to do all, and you could even do all. But if there's any room for imperfection, it could be held against you because you used an absolute like that. And then using words like recommend or should, those are soft and squishy languages that we want to avoid in governing documents. Those are better words for like non-governing documents. Words that you want to use in governing documents are words like very concrete language like must and allowed and prohibited and shall. So examples of what procedures are. Procedures are a governing document. They don't scale across the business because they really operate at the business process level. They're created by individual teams and services. Those could be rug books or diagrams or step-by-step instructions. The point here is that you definitely want to be able to make those available to who those need to be available to. And those are maintained and operated by those individual teams or services. They can make them available to everyone at the business, if everyone at the company, if it needs to. But they're not necessarily, they don't need the policy and standard level of subscription that company-wide feel. So your policy and standard foundation are really going to meet compliance controls at a very bare minimum. You're going to have some mandatory content foundation. And so we really want to satisfy the content of the compliance controls. So I emphasize satisfy here because we're not going to take some requirement out of ISO or SOC 2 and copy and paste it into our policies and our standards. That's not really going to work well because it may not match the culture or the processes or the terminology that you use at your company. And so adopting the right language for your company while still meeting different compliance frameworks is important. And so we want to satisfy those controls. We don't want to just copy them verbatim. And then you want to build on compliance. While compliance is important, you certainly don't want to stop at just meeting compliance and checking that box. You need to go above and beyond and have other benchmark best practices. So I mentioned earlier that best practices could be a non-governing document. There might be an industry document that says what the best practices are, and those are really non-governing documents, but you might take some of those best practices and actually integrate them into your policies and standards and say, these are must at our company. And then you have company-specific requirements. It might be a risk that nobody else has in the industry or across your across your competitors or whatever it might be. And so you need to write in a requirement, a security requirement that's unique to your company. And so you build on that compliance foundation doing those two things. So diving a bit deeper on what the structure would look like. So you're going to have those compliance satisfying those compliance controls, and then you're also going to have company-specific requirements and benchmark best practices that apply to all environments across the board. And so you want to scale that as much as possible as the bare minimum requirements. But then you might have some other areas in the company that are cardholder data environments, where if you're like a very highly regulated company or industry, you might all your environments might meet PCI, HIPAA, and FedRAMP, because you may not need breakout sections of documents for this. But for some companies, for example, at Adobe, we have cardholder data environments, but not every single one of our environments has to adhere to the PCI DSS framework. And so for those cardholder data environments, they have to adhere to the requirements that are all above here, which is the all environments, those company specific requirements and the compliance controls. But then they also have to adhere to those additional stringent requirements for cardholder data environments, or environments containing protected health information, or environments that work with government contract, with governments, or with the U.S. federal government in this case. And then there's other more stringent frameworks out there besides PCI, HIPAA, or FedRAMP that may be broken out. And the purpose for that is so that you're not just creating a HIPAA security set of documents, or a FedRAMP policy, or a PCI set of security documents. Instead, you're able to scale those documents across all different compliance frameworks, and where those are unique, you just call it out in a separate section within the same documents that you already use across the board. So you're not having to multiply your documents unnecessarily. So one source of truth is very important, is that individuals over time, your employees over time, will start to learn where it is that your policies live. But if they live here and here and here and here, then you're not going to have one uniform way to identify where your documents are. It's also makes it really hard to review and update. And so our recommendation, what we do at Adobe, is we actually have an intranet site that we call Inside Adobe, and it has a search box, and we put a PDF of all our policies and standards on that site. And so we also have a site where they're all linked. It's our technology policies and standards, but we also have it indexed. So if you search by keywords or search by the title of the document, it's going to come up in the search. Now, I know there's other policy management tools out there that integrate with SharePoint, and those are great as well. This is just something that's worked really well for us. So this is really the meat of our process at Adobe, of what we've done to really turn the corner on our policies and standards. And so sometimes the scenario is where a number of compliance individuals get in a room and they write, say, a wireless security standard. And in that wireless security standard, they write what the requirements are from a compliance perspective, and then they meet compliance, or maybe they'll write in a few additional ones. And then they go to the person who actually implements the wireless security at the company and then say, okay, this is what you have to follow now. There's not a whole lot of buy-in with that kind of approach. Instead, the better model is to have a coordinator, typically someone who works in a compliance role, so at least they know the bare minimum compliance requirements, working directly with those process and control owners, the people who are actually implementing those security requirements at your company. And so they're coaching them on how to write a document. Typically, the coordinator is going to do a lot of the writing and helping, because the driver may not be as familiar with that. But their direct input is very important, so that you're meeting compliance, but you're also getting a realistic written picture of what the company is actually doing, so that you're not stating things that are aspirational, but you're stating things that are realistic, but still meeting compliance and also meeting the other company-specific requirements or best practices. And then you have your approvers, which are typically operating at like a VP, senior manager, or director level. And then your contributors are really important to the process. You might have other wireless security experts using our wireless security example, or you might have legal individuals or other compliance individuals, or management that just wants to be involved, or at least throughout the process as you're reviewing this document. And then we have our informed. Those are individuals who don't necessarily need to be part of the review or part of actually creating a policy or standard, but they need to know when it's been published at least. And so this whole idea around collaborative intelligence is really, really important, so that we can kind of crowdsource these documents and get everyone input. So then later we get everyone's buy-in. I can't count the number of times where you'll publish a document, and regardless of how hard you try, even after it's published, there will be complaints. But there's a lot less complaints if you try to get as much collaborative intelligence to start, rather than trying to get that input later. And so here's what a typical review cycle would look like. You develop your documents, you put them under review, you approve them, you publish them, and then eventually it may be retired or merged with another document. And then typically those documents repeat half that process on an annual basis. So looking at that life cycle, and then also our DAISY model, drivers, approvers, contributors, and informed, is that our drivers, contributors, and approvers is we actually have automation and notifications around this. Is that there are a lot of different policy management applications out there that may have a slightly different approach to this, but this is exactly what we've created with our own tool. We created in-house using some features in Archer, and we had our drivers, contributors, and approvers. They're notified automatically when a document is under review, and this is done on an annual basis. And then they're also notified when the documents are in approval and published. And the drivers, contributors, and approvers, and those informed are different for every document. And so our workspace in our tool actually tracks who those individuals are, and it changes all the time. We're having to constantly update those, but it's better than having to send out an email and try to find out who should be involved. We just already have it documented and automated. And then those who are informed, they're just notified when it's published. In our case, it's often individuals who work in like a security engagement where they're talking with customers and answering questions. So they need to know when documents have been published again so that they can review what has changed. So managing changes around policies and standards. So a history section is really important so that the approvers can then look through a summary of the history section so they know what it is that they're approving rather than having to read through the document. This is also really important for those that are informed about a publication of a document. And then we have notifications, which we've talked about. We also have quarterly briefings and quarterly summaries. So our quarterly briefings are in person, or sorry, right now virtually, with our security champions, where we provide a summary of what actually has occurred. And then our quarterly summary is really the email that we send out to our security champions and a number of other security interested people as to what has been updated in our security policies and standards. So that way we're keeping people continually informed, continuing to socialize and evangelize the fact that these documents exist and what has changed in them. And then we also have our tool that we use that tracks all of the requested changes. So we'll get changes throughout an entire year. We're able to track those, and when the document's under annual review, we're able to bring all those change requests up at one time rather than having to haphazardly put them in periodically. Now, every once in a while, there is an emergency update, and those are sometimes justified because maybe we'll state something that's misleading, or we'll state something that we shouldn't have stated that's actually not realistic or actually not even happening in the company. And so we'll have to remove those. And so those will happen every once in a while, but for the most part, you'll just have these kind of requested changes that can wait until the annual update. So this is what really helped us turn the corner at Adobe, is creating some sort of uniform and professional branding on our policies and standards. So we created this artwork and we put it as a header. Well, we didn't create it, but we used this artwork that was already in place at our company and through some of our branding. And we worked with our branding team to actually put this on our policies and standards. And then it gave it a more serious tone to it. And we only exclusively use this artwork on our policies and standards so that it's clear that this is a technology and security policy or standard. And we don't use it on procedures. We don't use it on our non-governing documents. It's important that this is what you're looking at when you see that artwork, is that you're looking at the bare minimum requirements or the strategy and commitment that the company has made in regards to technology and security. That's what you're about to read. And so it's a very quick identifier with our security policies and standards. And so this is really actually helped us quite a bit to be able to do that. And we don't have like a separate, we use like a separate template for procedures. We don't have something that's like this. We exclusively use this for our policies and standards. So exceptions is a whole, it's related to policies, directly related to it, but it's also a totally separate process. Is that sometimes you need a documented allowance to deviate from security or technology governing requirements. And really exceptions are a last resort, but you need to be able to document that and you need to have a process in place. In fact, ISO 27001 specifically mandates that you have a policy exceptions process. It doesn't say how it needs to be done or what are the bare minimum requirements for having one, but it does say you need to have one. So this is what we've done at Adobe, and it's worked well for us. And so hopefully this is a good baseline. So summarizing what we do is that we have a tool that we use, and that's part of our policy management tool, where people fill out a form when they want some sort of exception. In that form, they cannot request exceptions that last longer than 1 year. It has to be less than 1 year, and there's no permanent exceptions. The reason for that, and let me just give you an example, is say that you've got a tool and you can't meet the standard requirement that multi-factor authentication be in place. That tool doesn't offer multi-factor authentication. And so you say, look, we need an exception to this requirement. And so it makes sense, but they say, look, the tool's never gonna change. But that's not true. The tool might change. The tool might actually implement MFA down the road. And so you need to make it a 1 year at a max. And then 1 year, let's revisit that and ask the question, is MFA now available? And that's a very simple scenario, but you always need to revisit, can this requirement be implemented now? Or can we implement better mitigating measures? The status quo always needs to be questioned. And so that's why we don't ever allow permanent exceptions. And then the submitter and the submitter's management has to accept the risk, and that needs to be documented. And then there needs to be some sort of independent review that's also documented. That's typically someone in security or our compliance security function that's independently reviewing what the team is requesting. And then you have to have mitigating measures in place. If you're not implementing a requirement, what are you doing to reduce the risk of not implementing that requirement? And that needs to be documented as well. So with exceptions and policy and standard and procedures, those governing documents, non-governing documents, using the right words, branding, notifications, we've talked about a lot of things here, but really this creates an ideal scenario where you have defined ownership. You're able to have better increased awareness by having one source of truth. You're sending out quarterly briefings and quarterly summaries. You're able to have your documents indexed on some sort of intranet site or SharePoint site or whatever it is that you could use. You're able to scale the business because these are company-wide policies and standards that everyone can subscribe to and buy into. There is a lot more buy-in as well because people are involved throughout the process, not after the process. There's alignment with compliance. We're able to meet bare minimum compliance requirements. We don't have a plethora, we don't have hundreds and thousands of documents across the board. Instead, we have a consolidated approach to our policies and standards where they can be identified by titles and subjects, and we're able to tie all that back. We're able to tie our exceptions back to all those different policies and standards that we know exist in that one source of truth. So that's my presentation. If anyone wants to reach out to me personally, my email is painterisaac@gmail.com, and here's my LinkedIn profile. Feel free to reach out to me. Thanks for listening.